Hi, this is Thomas from Apex Game Tools. In this video, we're going to be looking at how we can create the action AI for use with our survival shooter demo. In the last video, we saw how we could create an AI for moving our little guy around, and now we need him to be able to shoot and throw his bombs. So as before, we will start by creating a new AI. We are going to call that player action 2. And again, we will have our default selector created. But now we actually have a situation where the first selector that we would like to use is actually identical to the one we created in the last video. So if we just switch to that AI, we actually want to reuse the logic of the first selector, that either it does something if it has enemies or it does nothing if it has no enemies. So instead of just writing that again, we can just go to this AI, copy it, and then go to our new AI and just paste it in there. Now, since we have already had this first selector added, and this is the root selector of our new AI, we just need to switch the copied selector to be our root, because this should be where we start. So I'm just going to click over here, or you can also right click and say set as root, and then this one will be the root, and we can just delete this for now. So now we have an identical one to what we had before. Just we need to change the name, so that we'll just change that to act or idle instead. Now, before we move on to the next selector, let me just mention that, as you can see, we now have two tabs open with Apex AI. By default, it will simply say Apex AI in the tab. The tabs are a fixed size, so it actually can only contain a very limited amount of text. But if you prefer, you can have the title, or as much of the title that is that you have room for, displayed in your tab. So if you have multiple tabs open, that will make it easier to see which is which. In order to do that, you just open the settings, and then you check the checkbox called Show Title in Tab, in which case it will show in the tab, as you can see. We can just leave that on for now. So the next step is to create our second selector. So we right click and we say add selector. Now in order to show a different kind of selectors, until now we've been using the highest score wins selector, but we're going to be using the first score wins just to show you how that one works, and what is different from that and the highest score wins. So there we have it. So what do we need to do? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to connect the two. So now that's set up, and next we want to have the different actions that we have available to us. So we will add a qualifier, and in this case we're going to add 4. Now if you're unsure what type to choose when you start out making a selector, just select one, and then if you decide that that wasn't the right one to use, you can always change the type of the selector, and it will just change the type, and it will still retain all the settings, as long as they are still relevant to that particular selector. Qualifier. As you can see here, change type. So let's just add a few more. Add one more of those. Add one more of those, and then we'll add one more. So there we go. Obviously, in order to create these selectors, you will need to have an idea of what you are actually able to do. So I already know what our little boy is able to do. He has 4 main things he can do. He can either heal if he has taken damage, he can throw bombs, he can reload his gun, or he can shoot his gun. So let's just set up the names for him first, so that we know what we have to do. So we can say heal, throw bomb, reload, oops, and shoot. So those are the qualifiers to choose between. And now, since we chose to use a first score wins qualifier, the order in which these are evaluated is important, because what it will do is that it will simply look at each of them in order as they appear here, and if one of them scores out, it will choose that one. So if it looks at heal and that one scores, it will just stop evaluating the rest and just choose that. Now, you could have just as well implemented this as the highest score wins, and just had the one with the highest score be the one selected. But when you have a well-defined priority like this, it is more efficient to use first score wins, because then you don't, if you actually evaluate this to true that you need to heal, then there's no reason to evaluate the rest of them. So let's start from the top. We want to evaluate whether or not we should heal. So again, we have a qualifier, an all or nothing qualifier. So we need to set up some scores, all of which need to score in order for this qualifier to be selected. Now, there are two criteria that we want to set up. First of all, if we haven't taken any damage, there's no need to heal. So we're going to check the health of our unit, and we're going to use this score called health below the threshold, and we're going to set that to a value. In this case, we're going to set it to 35 instead of the default of 30, because the big elephants actually do 30 damage, so we just need to have a little bit of a margin so that we can actually heal if we are low, and not able to die on that last hit. So again, since this is actually not the actual score is not really important in this scenario, because again, if it scores, it will get selected. So we can set that to whatever. Just to keep it in thread with how the default is implemented, we are just going to give it a threshold of 100 and a score of 200. It might as well have been 10 and 20, it doesn't really matter. Next up, in order to heal, we also need to have something to heal with, so we also need to ensure that we have some band-aids, otherwise it doesn't make sense to try and heal if we can't do it. So if we do have band-aids, again, we will just score that at 200. So if we have band-aids and our health is below 35, then this one will score out, and since it is on the top of the list on this selector, it will get selected. Next up is throw bomb. Now we want our unit to, or our little boy, to throw bombs if he gets in trouble. So if he is too close to enemies, he should throw bombs to get rid of those enemies so that he can get to safety. Again, we have an all or nothing qualifier, so we do the same as before. We set a threshold of 100, and then we add a few scores to determine whether or not we can actually throw bombs, or if it is relevant for us to throw bombs. Now we can start with the obvious one: can throw a bomb. Can we do it? And this has to do, this combines two things. It tests that we actually have bombs, and it also tests that we haven't used a bomb within a certain time frame. The default is that he can use a bomb every 1 second. Next up, we will have a score to test if we should use the bomb, and that is dependent on whether or not we have any enemies. And this means that we can reuse what we have done before. We have this target has enemies in range, so we're going to use that again, and again score that at 200. So if we have enemies that are in range, then we will score this out. And if we also have bombs, then this one will be scored out and it will throw bombs. Unless it is damaged, in which case it will heal. So moving on to reload. When he shoots, he uses his ammo, so when he runs low or runs out of ammo, he will have to reload his gun. So in order to test that, we have a score that is called is gun loaded. So if the gun is not loaded, we want to reload. So we're going to check the knots, and then we're going to give this a score of whatever. Again, it doesn't really matter because it will be selected if it scores out, because all these two will not have scored, and then this will, if it scores, it will get selected. Now we chose to have this qualifier be an all or nothing qualifier. We can leave it at that, as that, but there's no reason to really. So we might as well use the change. So we're just gonna change that to a simpler one. That will just do a sum of its children. Now, since this only has one scorer, we could have also just implemented this directly as a custom qualifier that did this logic. But since we're actually going to use this is gun loaded again, we can just use it as a sum of children, even though it only has one child. And that brings us to our shoot, which uses the exact same scorer, is gun loaded. This is what determines whether or not we will be able to shoot. And this one we actually want to do the default one. If it is loaded, it should be selected. And then we have our default action with this default score of 1, which will just do nothing. So now we have set up the qualifiers, so we can make the decision of what to do. But right now it's not actually doing anything because all of these qualifiers have no actions. So let's just quickly add actions to them all. For the first 3, this is very simple. Heal, we simply want to use a band-aid. For throw bomb, we want to throw a bomb. And for reload, we want to reload. And then we have shoot. Now this is a little more involved, because we don't just want to shoot blindly, just spray and pray. We're actually going to try and select targets and shoot at the most relevant target. Now since we want to do multiple things, what we're going to add is a composite action. We're going to call that acquire and shoot, and then we're going to add the appropriate actions to this composite action. So the first thing we want to do is we want to find the target to attack, and we have this method, this action here called set best attack target. This will assign attack target to our player so that he has something to attack. And the next action is to actually do the attack. So this is going to be the shoot at attack target, or fire at attack target is what we've called it here. So now these are set up. But this one, set best attack target, this is actually does nothing on itself. This is again one of these actions with options. It will be given the different possible targets, and then it will score these targets and it will select the best one. So we need to define what actually scores different targets to select the best one. So again, we click the plus to select between different option scores. And as you can see, there are 3 available. Let's select this one first, is alive. We'll give that a pretty high score, because unless the target is alive, it doesn't really make sense to attack it. Next one, enemy proximity. This is the same as the other proximity tests that we have been covering in the other AIs. It basically scores according to the proximity of the enemy to the player. So the closer it is to a given to the player, the better it will score. We can set this to, well, 50, let's say. So the further it is from the player, the lower the score will be. So it will basically subtract the distance from itself to the player from the score. So units right next to the player will score almost 50, and units far away will score, well, less. Units more than 50 away will score 0. So this would actually be enough, but we have one more that we can add, and it's called the isCurrent target. Now this is basically again a tiebreaker, and it is to prevent oscillation. So if we end up having two targets that score the same, so they're both alive, and they're also at the same distance to the player, then if we're already shooting at one of them, we just want to keep shooting at that same target instead of switching to the other one. So we just give this a very minimal score. So this basically means, since these relate to each other, it means that this one will always score 100. So this one will score depending on the distance, and this one will score 1.5. So what it means is that if I'm already attacking an enemy, I will not switch targets unless that other enemy that I'm also evaluating gets closer than the one I'm already attacking, than this 1.5 meters. That's basically what it means in practice. So that's it. We have the scores set up, and then once it has selected the best target, it's just going to start firing at it. Now you've already seen it in action, so we're just going to skip that. We will be looking at the AI in action again in the next video, where we'll be covering visualization. But for now, we're just going to have a quick look at some of the implementations of these different actions. So let's switch to the code. So most of these actions are quite simple. As you can see, we have the use band-aids one, and it simply calls the use band-aid method on the player, and the actual logic for doing that is implemented on the player. And that the same goes for throwing bombs and reloading the gun. They are equally simple. And actually the same goes for the fire attack target. It has a little more logic in it. As you can see, it will either stop firing or start firing depending on whether or not we actually have an attack target. The attack target will be reset once the target dies, and since the AI is the one assigning attack targets, it may take a few milliseconds until the next attack target is assigned, and we don't want to be shooting into space. So those were the actions. Sorry, we have one more here. The set best attack target. That's the last action. Now this is, as mentioned, the action with options. This scores the different entities, the enemies, according to our different scores. The enemies are represented by what we've called a living entity. This is game code specific for the demo. And as you can see, it is implemented like any other option scores or action with options. It simply gets the best one from the available options, in this case the enemies, and then it sets the target to whatever is returned. Now, as you might have noticed also in the previous video when we looked at some of these actions with options, some of them had these conditionals where we have something that is only run in the Unity editor. This is for visualization, so this will be covered in the next video. And this finally we will be looking at these two of these scores. Again, very simple. This one with health, is it alive? Well, if its health is above 0, then it is. Otherwise, it's not. And the same with current target. Is this the player's current target? Yes, we score. No, we score 0. So that is all there is to it. We have a complete AI. So in the next video, we'll be looking at how we can debug and visualize the behavior of the AI. See you in that next video.